And now, Columbia Gorge Christian Fellowship announcements.
Hello, ladies. Just a reminder that the Woman of the Word Bible study is tomorrow. It starts at 6 p.m. Monday night here at Columbia Gorge Christian Fellowship. Come prepared for an awesome night of study and fellowship. What a great time to invite some friends. Don't forget to mark your calendars, and I'll see you there.
Hey, brothers and sisters. Prayer is so important to our walk with our Father and to fellow believers. We're inviting you to Wednesday night prayer group from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. We would love to have you join us. You can send prayer requests through our website or with our prayer wall located in our fellowship room, where you can write your prayer request on a rolled up piece of paper, and we'll pray as a group when we read those. We'd love to see you.
Come watch the Athey Creek Watch Party live stream this Wednesday starting at 7 p.m. to about 8:30 p.m. We would love to have you come join us.
Oh, well, now try it. Oh, stop. Is it working? Is it? Should be. Oh, okay. My bad. I'll take the hit. Okay. We just finished the Sermon on the Mount. Everybody remember that? Okay. Oh, good. You remember that. I just want to back up a little bit and kind of give us a little background, a little perhaps tools to think about before we move on into this next section. I'm going to have to pick up the pins that someone dropped, not mentioning names, because that will distract me. Okay, so here we are. We're going through the book of Matthew. And I think I've mentioned before that it is very helpful to know a little bit of the culture, a little bit of what's going on as we dive into these. Is this going to totally revamp our thinking? Probably not. But will it enhance the way we look at it? I think so. Look, let me give you an example, right? It's helpful to know perhaps the motives of someone to really understand what's going on. I'm going to give you an example. This couple, they were married, happily married, in fact. And the husband, he stood on the scale in the bathroom one morning, and he was standing there, and he sucked his gut way in. And his wife happened to see him. And she's like, "Oh, honey, that ain't going to help." And he's like, "Oh, well, yes, it is." And she's like, "Oh, really?" He's like, "Yeah, I can't see the numbers if I don't." Right? So it does make a difference if you know somebody's motive, right? What they're thinking. Right? Because you guys probably thought that he was trying to get a lower reading. No, he just couldn't even see the numbers, right? So a similar, not exactly, but similar as we go through Scripture. And one of the things that we've talked about before is how much material it took to have a scroll of the Bible, right? We'd call it a book, but it was a scroll. And back in the day, they'd have to write it on skins. And so think about as these writers are writing down the New Testament, right? They're making sure that what they write down has a lot of impact because it takes a lot of effort to even have it. It's kind of like, for those of you that are a little older, back in the day, when you took a picture of something, you had a thing called the camera, okay? And inside of it was film. And you would take a picture, and then you had to take it to a facility, and usually it was gone for, a week, unless you wanted to pay a little extra, and you could get the 1 hour photo finishing, and then you could get your picture. And you were always very deliberate on what you took a picture of, right? Because it took a lot of effort just to get that picture. And then, came the digital camera, right? And that really streamlined things because then you realize, hey, I don't have to go and process this, and it really doesn't cost me anything more to take 5 pictures of something than it does 1, okay? And now we have it on our cameras, right? You take a picture and, oh, wow, it's great. And even in my job, it's the use of the the camera versus digital photography has made a huge difference. An example, so, I design things, and then they get constructed, and usually there's an inspector that goes out and inspects, right? And a lot of times he'll take pictures and bring them in. Well, back when we had film, right, they had to think a little bit about what they were going to take a picture of because it took so much effort to get the picture. I can remember once we got digital cameras, there was one inspector in particular. We were doing a job out in Morrow, and he brings the pictures and I download them, and I'm looking through, right, so I can see progress of the job. And there's all these pictures of female flaggers, right? And it's like, okay, it didn't really cost anything more, but that's really not helping me understand what's going on. So there can be a downside of that. And I know we talked before about the fact that Christians were instrumental in creating codex, right? What's codex? Well, that means a book. A codex was, back in the day, they wrote on scrolls, okay? Christians come along, and they're like, man, we got to get the word out. And so they're like, you know what? Let's write on both sides of the paper, or the lambskin, right? So they're writing on both sides. So they changed the way technology happened, literally. And you're like, is it really technology when you're, grinding up ashes and writing on an animal skin? Well, yeah, it's the technology they had. So as we go through Scripture, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, but hang in there. As you go through the Bible, as you read it, think of it kind of like a novel. Okay, now when I say a novel, somebody's going to say, oh, you think the Bible's fiction? No. I think the Bible is absolutely true. But I think the writers of the Bible, right, they're going to foreshadow things that may come up later, like would happen in a novel. Right? I think I told you the story of my cousin. I did his memorial here, I don't know, a couple, 3 weeks ago. And I told you the story about the airplane, right, when we flew in the airplane, remember that? Well, I told another story, and this is an example, I guess, of the foreshadowing I'm talking about. When we were in middle school, we had gone up to the Tri-Cities, and his dad had purchased a 4-function calculator. Okay, yeah, 4-function. It had the red glowing numbers. Okay, and my cousin and I, on the way back, were like, hey, we should go, and they had an office, right? They needed a 4-function calculator. They had a adding machine, which is about this big, and it had a lever, right? And so my cousin and I, we get back, we're like, oh, we got to go in and check it out, make sure it's working. And so, and so we're middle schoolers, and we were in there for quite a while, verifying whether the 4-function calculator matched what the adding machine did. And we did some addition, some multiplication, and then we're like, you know what? Long division. And so we took turns doing long division manually and then verifying it with the calculator. Now you might say, why are you even telling this story? Well, this is an example of foreshadowing, okay? Because I'm an engineer and my cousin was an accountant. Oh, a couple of nerdy boys who are going to, in their future life, are going to play with calculators. Oh, that's why that story is included, right? It's just kind of funny. And as you look back and you're like, I wonder what that did look like, God looking down going, that's funny. Right? Because it is, thinking that we were going to outsmart the calculator. But we did end up with a pretty good feeling that the calculator worked. Okay, so as we go through these stories, the Bible's kind of like that as well. And so we're going to jump in, and remember, this book, Matthew, was written to, do we remember? The Jews, right? Okay, it was written to Jewish people. So there's kind of a Jewish mindset and a Jewish flavor. And that's kind of, it's important to think about. And as we look at this, it's going to make a little bit of context as we jump into this. And this first story we're going to look at is about leprosy. Okay? So, does the Bible talk about leprosy? It sure does. Okay? In fact, in Leviticus, like 12, 13, 14, 15, there's a lot of rules about leprosy. And when we think of leprosy today, typically we think of Hansen's disease, right? That's the stereotypical leprosy, where you start getting numb in your fingers and your nose, right? And then what happens with that kind of leprosy, critters can start chewing on your finger and you don't feel it, right? You burn your finger and you don't feel it. And so things start getting messed up pretty bad. But biblical leprosy also included other skin diseases. And in Leviticus, it goes in great detail about these diseases. And what happens is if you had leprosy, right, if you were diagnosed with leprosy, whether it be the Hansen's type leprosy we think of today, or whether it be one of these skin conditions, what happened is you were deemed unclean. Okay, and in the Jewish mindset, there was only one state that was worse than being leprous, and that was death. Right? The only way you could be more unclean would be to be dead. Okay? And so, if you touched a leper, right, you were unclean. And so, if you were unclean from touching a leper, typically that cleansing, right, you were ceremonially unclean. And what that meant, you couldn't go to the house of worship, okay, until you went through a cleansing process. Typically, the cleansing process of just touching a leper was basically you had to go wash, and then you were unclean until sunset, okay, till there was a new day start. And so what happens is this uncleanness, for a long time, I thought of it as being, if you were unclean, it was like a sin, okay? But it's not. It's a state, and it's a picture, and that picture is that you're not fit for being in the presence of God, okay? And you're like, well, I'm not sure I'm tracking. Well, hang on, we'll get there. So, for example, there were certain things that would make you unclean, like the woman's monthly reoccurrence, right? That made you ceremonially unclean, okay? And it's like, is that a sin? Well, of course not. No, it's a natural course of life. However, it did make you ceremonially unclean until you had the proper cleansing. So what's that all about? Well, what it's about, it's a picture, and let's think about it. The female monthly event involves blood, okay? Blood is where the life is, okay? And so if you're losing blood, maybe that is a picture of God, right? The giver of life, and you've, no fault of your own, but you've lost life, right? You've lost blood, which is a picture of life. You need to be cleansed before you can get back into the kingdom or into the place of God, right? Guys, if they have bodily emissions, similar deal, right? And if you kind of work through that, okay, that makes sense, right? It's the life-giving, and it's been spilt on the ground, so to speak. Well, you're not fit to be in the presence of God at that point. Now, same thing happens with this leprosy, right? It's a picture of uncleanness, right? And if you touch someone, it spreads, and so you have to be ceremonially cleansed. So what happens is people would have to, maybe you can relate to this, if you had been diagnosed with leprosy in the Old Testament, you had to wear tattered clothes, okay? You had to grow your hair long, unkept, and you had to cover your upper lip with like a mask, okay? And then you had to stay 6 feet apart, right? Okay, I mean for real, right? And you had to say unclean, unclean. So people knew, right? That you were unclean because they didn't want to get ceremonially unclean. And, right, so there's that spiritual part of it, right, for sure. But, also, right, come on, we've all been there now. Like unknown disease type stuff, right? Like, what's going on, right? These people have a disease. I don't want to catch it, right? Because if I catch it, then I'm unclean. And if you had this diagnosis of leprosy, you had to stay outside the camp, right? You couldn't come in until the leprosy went away. Well, what if it didn't go away? Well, then you were outside the camp, right? You were ceremonially unclean. So, as I was reading through Leviticus, and some people are like, Leviticus, ooh, that's pretty rough reading. Okay, well, as you read through there, I was reading through here, studying this on leprosy, and it's like the Lord spoke right to me. And it's like, the Lord spoke right to you? I'm like, yeah, the Lord spoke right to me as I was going through Leviticus, and we're going to look at that and see if you can see it, okay? It won't make as big an impact to you as it did to me, but let's put that up. It's Leviticus 13, 40 and 41. And let's see what it says. It says, right now I'm studying. It says, as for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on the forehead, but he is clean. Like, spoke right to my heart, right? Right? And you may not find that particular one as moving as I did, right? But you're not going to find those unless you're in there reading them. I will give you a little context on that, because you might be like, that seems a little peculiar. Well, what happens is, this is another example of leprosy. Well, this isn't, right? Because if you're just bald, you're clean. But if your hair falls out and you got scabby red stuff all over it, oh, that could be leprosy, right? So that's what that is. You can take that off. That was just kind of funny. So anyway, even in Leviticus, God can speak right to you. So we've got this story, this background on leprosy. And so here we go. Verse 1 of chapter 8, it says, when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. All right, we got that far. And we have to stop and look at this, because where had Jesus just been? Up on the mountain teaching. Okay? So, believe it or not, there were great crowds that listened to his teaching. Right? It wasn't just the miracles, because we're going to get into the miracles now, but there was a great crowd that followed him, and it says, and behold, a leper, and this is why we've had the whole leper background story, came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. All right, let's stop there. So here, this leper comes to Jesus, and he says, if you will, you can make me clean. Now, this next part is something for you to think about, because, and it says, and Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. So, here's the question. Did Jesus become ceremonially unclean when he touched the leper? Now, judging from my research, half of you are going to say, absolutely not. Jesus would not be ceremonially unclean because he's the Son of God. And Jesus couldn't be unclean. And the other half of you are going to say, however, he was a human. And he abided by the law. And he touched this guy. So he must have been ceremonially unclean for a while, right? So think about that. And if you're expecting me to give you the answer, no, I ain't going, no, it's not that easy. Right? But do you follow what I'm saying? And here's the thing I think that you want to think about is, here's Jesus, and here's a person who's hurting, right? This guy hasn't been touched by unleprous people in a long time. And here's Jesus, right, creator of the universe, who's willing to reach out and touch this guy. And he says, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. And some people will say, see, he really wasn't a leper, because when Jesus touched him, the leprosy went away. But I'd say, well, yeah, but he touched a leper. So was he unclean? And as I said previously, generally it was you had to go wash and then come back in the evening, right? And then you'd be cleansed, right? So a small portion of time, Jesus could have been ceremonially unclean. Think about that, right? And does that change your total view of Jesus? Well, not your total view, but it might change it a little bit, right? Like, oh, you mean Jesus was willing to become unclean to heal this guy? Yeah, right? Right? He certainly was unclean when he died for our sins, right? Because death is the worst condition of uncleanness. Verse 4 says, "And Jesus said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift that Moses commanded for proof to them.'" I love this part because here is Jesus, and he says to this guy who's been cleansed of leprosy, hey, go to the priests. Because back in Leviticus, there's a whole section of what you need to do to be cleansed from leprosy, right? Fantastic. And we know from other Gospels that the guy doesn't do what Jesus asked him to do, in that he doesn't tell he says, say that you say nothing to anyone. Turns out that this guy told everybody, right? Can you blame him? Yes and no, right? Because what happens is then you start getting a spectacle following Jesus about healing and such, and so it makes it hard for Jesus to minister. But he's to go and offer this sacrifice that's required to the priest, so it's a proof to them, right? And it's a proof to the priests, and the priests need to know that, hey, there's a guy that heals somebody from leprosy, right? And that's big news. Okay, so we saw this in this book written to Jews, that the first miracle in this book was to somebody who was ceremonially unclean. Now this next section we're going to look at is interesting because I don't know if you guys have you ever heard of the Jewish morning prayer, which is they call the morning blessing, which is the Birkat Hashakar? Ringing a bell? No. Okay. Anyway, and this is in the Talmud, and during this time, there were Jewish men that would pray this prayer, and it goes like this: "Dear God, thank you that I was not made a Gentile, I was not made a slave, and not made a woman." Oh, there we go. We got somebody riled up. Right, but this was a Jewish prayer, and it still is, right? It's in the Talmud, and it's this prayer that a guy would typically say in the morning. Okay, so it's, God, thanks that I'm not a Gentile, I'm not a slave, and I'm not a woman, right? They've kind of softened that today. However, it's important to know that as we dive into this next section, okay? So they don't like Gentiles, they don't like slaves, and they don't like women. Well, I guess don't like isn't the right word, but look down upon? Okay, so check it out. Verse 5, he says, "When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him." So a centurion is a military guy, okay? Generally, this time, right, it's going to be a Roman military guy, okay, not Jewish, okay? So he's a Gentile, and he's in the occupying force, right? Imagine if there was an occupying force that controlled us. We wouldn't be happy about it, right? So what happens is this guy, he comes and he says, "Lord, my servant is paralyzed at home, suffering terribly," right? So, Lord, my servant, probably a good likelihood that this person's a slave. Okay, so we got a Gentile who's coming to Jesus, asking for healing for his slave, okay? And he says that he's suffering horribly. And this is an absolutely amazing story. And Jesus is going to notice that. He says, but he said to him, and this is Jesus, he says, and I said to him, I will come and heal him. Now check this out. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him. Well, let's stop there. So Jesus is like, yeah, I'll go to your house and heal this guy. Okay, so straight off the bat, if you're a Jewish reader and you're reading, okay, Jesus healed somebody who was as unclean as it gets. The next story we have is all of a sudden Jesus is going to help out a centurion, right, who's a Roman, and an occupier, and a Gentile, to heal his slave, right? Okay. And then Jesus is like, yeah, dude, I'll go to your house. And the dude, right, I don't know if that was his name, but, you know, the centurion, right, he's like, hey, you know what? You don't need to go to my house, right? And think about this. Think about this for a minute. What this guy is saying. He's saying, hey, you don't need to come and do some magic spell. The centurion's saying, hey, I understand how this works. You have authority in this world. And you don't have to come and do anything. You can just say the word and it will happen. Okay? He's like, I get it because, you know, I'm a centurion and I command guys and they do what I tell them to. And in the same way, I know you, Jesus, command this world and it does what you tell it to. And it says, when Jesus heard this, he marveled. So imagine, right? Jesus notices what this guy says and he marvels. I want to look at something. Another verse, Mark 6, 3 through 6. Okay? And so this is another one of those where Jesus marveled. There's a couple of times where Jesus marveled at people. Okay? So let's look at this one. And so this is Mark 6, verse 3. It says, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph, and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. Here it is. And he marveled because of their unbelief, and he went about among the villages teaching. The point here is that same word marvel is the same in the other story. In both times, Jesus is marveling about somebody's faith. Okay, so in my life, would I like Jesus to marvel? Sure, right? But I don't want to be the one he marvels because of their unbelief. Right? So, yeah, Lord, be keen if you were marveling at something I said, but you want to make sure that it's on the faith side of the aisle and not the disbelief side of the aisle, right? So Jesus marveled, and he said to those who followed him. Now, remember, right, this is where that whole thing about the book, and it's written to the Jews and the Jewish attitude, right? Like none of these people thus far we've seen getting treated and addressed in this story are on the Jewish, like, oh, these guys have it all together. Check out what Jesus says. He says, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. Okay, so we got a Gentile, not good in their eyes. Okay, and Jesus is like, I tell you what, I haven't seen anybody in all of Israel with faith like this. He says, I tell you, many will come from the east and the west and recline at a table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Wow, right? Because remember, the Jewish mindset is, hey, Lord, thanks for not making me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. And Jesus is shaking that all up. He's like, you know what? There's going to be a bunch of Gentiles, right? Because when he talks about from the east and the west, east and west of Israel, are a bunch of Gentiles. And he says, well, the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the centurion, and to the centurion Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. So here we see Jesus, right? And he's like blown away. And then he makes a point of pointing out that, hey, you know what? This guy has faith. And he has real faith. And you Jews are sitting here, some of you listening, right? You have no faith. You're just saying that prayer, right? Oh, thanks for not making me like them. And Jesus is pointing out that ain't it, right? It's that faith that the centurion has. Verse 14, he says, and when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. All right, so I don't know if any of you come from a Catholic background, right? This is one of those where, because Peter has a mother-in-law. Okay, so in order to get a mother-in-law, you have to have a wife, right? And so the Catholics, and I'm not bashing Catholics in this portion, but the point is that Catholics, right? They're big on celibacy, okay? But and who do the Catholics say the first pope was? Peter, okay? But Peter has a wife and a mother-in-law. Apparently, get this, not only does Peter have a wife and a mother-in-law, but apparently he gets along with his mother-in-law, right? That's probably noteworthy. Apparently it is. I got along well with my mother-in-law, by the way. And you can, right, of course, you're like, oh, he's saying that, because Sharon's here today. But no, I did. I got along great with my mother-in-law. Lived in, and you might say, oh, that's probably because she lived hundreds of miles away. No, I lived in very close proximity to my mother-in-law for a long time and got along well. Sounds like I'm tooting my own horn there. But no, I'm like, where'd that come from? I guess the point is that Peter has his mother-in-law living with him, right? That's kind of an interesting dynamic. And it says, verse 15, it says, he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. Amen. Right, I mean, I guess we can see why Peter really likes his mother-in-law, because she's been sick, she's not feeling well. Immediately, Jesus touches her, and she gets up and makes a sandwich for him. Right? I mean, is that the takeaway? You kind of get that feeling. And she rose and began to serve him. And I'm guessing the him is Jesus, but still, right? She gets up and she starts serving. And we see, and like I said, I was poking a little bit at Catholicism, but we do see that Peter was married, right? He was married and had a wife and a mother-in-law. And that didn't prevent him from being a disciple, right? It was just part of his life, and that's where Jesus met him. Verse 16, it says, that evening they brought to him many who were oppressed with demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. So, after he finishes healing Peter's mother-in-law, later that evening, Jesus goes on to heal more people. And not only heal more people, In verse 16 it says, that evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. And I thought that I would throw something out there, something for you to think about, and that is demons. Okay? One of the interesting things in the New Testament, we see a lot of Jesus casting out demons. Now, the reason I bring this up is I'm not going to do a study on demonology, right? And there are people that do that. But I just want you to be thinking about, where do demons come from? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Like, where in the world do demons come from? Maybe you haven't asked yourself that question. Maybe you have it settled in your mind. Well, there's a possibility. I'm going to shake that up a little bit. But I just want you to know that there isn't a passage that is the, that's the word I'm looking for, the owner's manual of demons is not in the Bible. Okay? So there's a little ambiguity. And so what I thought I would do is give you something to think about. You know, what is this all about? Because one of the things in Jesus' ministry, we see a lot of demonic activity. So where do they come from? Right? What's going on there? Well, there's three mainline Christian theories about where demons come from. All right? And so the first one, and I'm going to give you the first one, which is a little, this is probably the fringiest of the three. Okay, so where do demons come from? Because Jesus, he cast them out. And when I talk about demons in this particular instance, what we're talking about is entities that go inside of another person, right? They have an identity. They have names, right? And so it's some kind of entity that possesses another person, and a lot of times Jesus cast these out. And we see in the New Testament, disciples cast them out. And so where do they come from? That's what our question is. The first theory, and like I said, this is the fringiest one, is a pre-Adamic race theory. Has anyone ever heard of the gap theory? Well, there's a few nods, that's good, because I won't have everybody freaked out. So the gap theory states, and we're going to look at Genesis 1:1. Oh, look at this. You know this one, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Can you go back to that first one again for me? Thanks, Ron. Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there are those that have created this theory called the gap theory. And what the gap theory, in a nutshell, is that here we see that God created the heavens and the earth. And we know when God creates something that it's perfect. Okay? And so what happens in verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was all over the face of the deep. That's the gap. The gap being God created it. And so those that subscribe to this theory are God created the earth perfect, and then at some point we see that now it's without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So what they propose is that there was a gap. Okay, and this is one of those, and maybe you'll see why it's fringy. Some of you might say, oh, I like it. But what the proponents of this theory say is that there was a whole race of beings that lived during that time, okay? And what happened is they were led astray by Lucifer, and they died, and that was what got us to this point of without form and void. Okay, and so what demons are the spirits of the entities that lived in the gap. Okay, so that's the gap theory. And there are those fairly mainstream people that subscribe to that. There's a lot, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a lot of filling in the blanks, right? Okay, so that's one theory. The next theory is the fallen angel theory, probably the most prominent you've seen, and that is that demons are fallen angels. And we see that we know, right? Throughout Scripture we see fallen angels, right? Scripture's about fallen angels. And typically we think of how many fallen angels are there? We think a third, right? A third of the angels fell. Interesting to note, the only place we know that number of a third is in Revelation 12:4. Okay, so, and there's certainly modern debate about when Revelation 12:4 occurred. Was it in the ancient past? Was it when Jesus was here, or was it in the future? So there's people that argue about Revelation 12:4, which is fine, they can argue all they want, but that's where we get the third of the angels are fallen. Okay, so the theory that fallen angels are demons comes from that we know that there are fallen angels, and those fallen angels at some point have the ability to possess humans, okay, and do things against their will. And certainly there's a bunch of people that today there's movements, demonology, I guess they call it. And do I personally, do I personally believe in demonic possession even today? And the answer is yes. Okay, sure. But it's not certainly something I focus on, right? I'm going to stay focused on Jesus. And if there are, do I think I've seen demonic type stuff? Yeah, sure. But in the same token, I guess it isn't always my first go-to, okay? And think about this, right? The wife's mad at you, probably saying, I think you're demon-possessed right now, probably isn't a good call, right? There might be something else. Could be something I did. That happens a lot. But you follow what I'm saying, that these are entities that possess people, and this is probably the most, I guess, popular theory that people have. And the next theory is kind of related to it. And we're going to look at another verse. And this next theory is the Nephilim theory. You ever heard of the Nephilim? Yeah, if Ken was here, he'd be all over it, right? Ken's kind of our local Nephilim expert. Anyway, so the Nephilim theory, we're going to read this, and hopefully it'll make sense. So I'm looking at Genesis 6:1. There we go. When man began to, so this is in Genesis 6, and this is just before Noah's flood, right? To give you some context. So just before the flood, this comes up, and he says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Okay? So, what does that mean? Well, what the Nephilim theory is that fallen angels involved in this story, and in verse, 1, I think? Can you back up to 1? Yeah, when man, and the next one too. The sons of God. Okay, so here, the sons of God, the Nephilim theory people say that the sons of God here means angels. Okay, so let's substitute fallen angels. So the fallen angels saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as many as their wives, as they chose. Go to the next one. And then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for his flesh, his days shall be 120 years, right? 120 years till the flood. And the next one, it says the Nephilim. Oh, here's the Nephilim part. So what this theory puts forth is that when the angels, fallen angels, copulated with women, and certainly there's people that are like, that don't even make sense. You know, angels and women have an offspring. You know, how's that work? Well, there's plenty of arguing on both sides how that works. But it says Nephilim were born in the earth in those days and also after, when the, air quote, angels came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, what the theory is that these fallen angels and women had offspring, and these offspring were Nephilim, and that's where they got the giants, okay? And so what happens when these Nephilim, and in King James language, they would call them bastard spirits or illegitimate spirits, right? Because you have half angelic, half human. And so when they died, right, and they were, a lot of them wiped out in this theory, right? They were wiped out with the flood, and the flood came. And so what happens is, the theory is that all these unclean spirits, these offspring, those are the ones that don't have a place to go, right? And you'll see Jesus, you know, when he speaks with the demons, right? Oh, you know, let us go into the pigs. It's interesting, right, that the pigs go into the water, right? Oh, and a bunch of the spirits in this theory, right? And it's a theory. A bunch of these spirits were wiped out, right? The Nephilim were wiped out because of the flood, right? So there's this water connection, right? Did the pigs like, hey, let's go drown these things because we know that wipes them out. Anyway, you might say, is there anything else that supports any of this? Let's look at this last verse, and this is in Jude 1, verse 6 and 7. So Jude, New Testament, and it says, and the angels, and so this is Jude, he's speaking about a lot of things, and he speaks about this incident, and the folks that have the theory about the Nephilim, they like to look at this verse and say, this gives credence to their theory. And it says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, as he kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So, the point, and we're wrapping it up for real. The point here is that in the New Testament, Jude makes some reference about angels that didn't stay within their position of authority. Okay, so like, that's kind of weird. And that they're kept in chains, eternal chains, under gloomy darkness until the judgment day. And this story is also linked with Sodom and Gomorrah and sexual immorality. So that's their other evidence for this Nephilim theory. The point now that I want to leave you with is that in Christendom, there's not a real clean understanding of where demons came from, right? And it's okay to be like, where does that happen? Because it's not clear. It really is not clear. But that doesn't, me personally, that doesn't put me off my rocker. It doesn't upset me. It gives me something to study and to investigate further. But we know for certain, right? We know for certain that they're real, right? They're real entities. Jesus interacted with them. And are they to be feared? No, not really. Right? The worst that a demon can do to a person, right, is turn them into a meat puppet, right, for lack of a better term. But Jesus has more power than that, right? Jesus indwells us. And think about that, right? Jesus indwells us. and not a demon. Okay? So, hopefully, if that upset you, we can talk. Right? I mean, for real, it's just something I want you to think about, that it's not cut and dry. And maybe you have sorted through it enough that you feel pretty cut and dry about which one of those three camps you're in. And there's some other even more esoteric ones, but that's the main thing. And I guess the final thought there is, yeah, sometimes there's things in the scripture we don't fully understand. Right? We don't. And I guess the thing that you want to take away is there's a lot of things I understand, and those are even harder to deal with. Right? Don't stumble on, oh, well, the guys can start passing out. You know, don't stumble on the, I think guys are going to pass out. Oh, yeah. Don't stumble on the things that are kind of esoteric and out there. If you're going to stumble on the ones that are like, oh, I need to turn my life over to Christ. Right? Wow, I need to humble myself. Right? It's not my works that gets me into heaven, it's Him. Right? And that should be where you stumble, right? At the feet of Jesus, and not at some esoteric theory of how things work out.